It's now my really great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Robert Shapiro, who is professor of Judaic Studies at Brooklyn College, is going to give a presentation about the Hersch Wasser collection, the Ringelblum archive, parts of which we have here at the YIVO Institute, and Professor David Engel, Maurice R, and Corinne P. Greenberg, Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University, is going to speak about recording the evidence of the Holocaust, bearing witness, and the act of resistance that is involved in doing so. We will then have a conversation and then I hope have some questions from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to begin by giving the first words to the person who really should be speaking on this topic of the Hersch Wasser collection and its connections with the Oyneg Shabes secret archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, and that is Emanuel Ringelblum. This is from his diary entry of June 26, 1942. Ringelblum wrote in Yiddish, "Friday the 26th of June was a great day for the Oyneg Shabes. Today at dawn we heard a British radio broadcast about the Polish Jews. It mentioned everything that we know so much about, Slonim and Vilna, Lemberg and Chelmno. For months we have been suffering because we thought that the world was indifferent to our tragedy, which is unprecedented in human history. We were angry at the Polish public and at those in contact with the Polish government in exile because there were no transmissions about the murders of the Polish Jews and the world remained in ignorance of what was happening. We blamed the Polish leaders for deliberately suppressing the news of our tragedy because we suspected that they did not want that news to overshadow what was happening to them. But now it is clear that all these efforts have achieved something. The BBC mentioned the figure of 700,000 murdered Jews. It also warned that these crimes would exact revenge and justice. The Oyneg Shabes has performed, Ringelblum continues, has performed a great historical mission. It has alerted the world to our fate and perhaps rescued hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews from extermination. The near future will show whether these hopes will come true." A diary is not a book of prophecies that are divinely ordained. It's a kind of frozen moment of hope, frozen moment of thought, of knowledge of the author of that time. The Oyneg Shabes materials that Ringelblum and his group put together are the single most important documentation of the catastrophe that befell the Jews of Warsaw and the Jews of Poland altogether. Of the approximately 60 co-workers of the secret archive, only 3 survived the war. One was Hersch Wasser, who was born in 1912, so he was 27 when the war began. A second survivor was his wife, Bluma Wasser, who was a typist and copyist and interviewer for the archive. And the third who survived was the author, Rachel Auerbach or Auerbach. Only those 3. And among those 3, only one of them, Hersch Wasser, knew where the documents had been buried. The documents were carefully concealed, carefully hidden. As far as we know, the Germans had no knowledge whatsoever of the existence of this secret ghetto archive project. In the summer of 1942, as the Great Deportation occurred that took away almost 300,000 of the Jews of Warsaw, a decision was made to bury the first cache. In February of 1943, a second cache was buried. That second cache was buried in those iconic big aluminum milk canisters that people may be familiar with as an image of hidden documentation. And a third cache was hidden on April the 4th, 1943, only 2 weeks before the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising itself. Two of those caches from August and from February were placed into the basement of a building at Novolipki 68, a building that housed a Borochov school sponsored by the Left Poalet Zion, Left Labor Zionist movement that Wasser and Ringelblum were both affiliated with. In 1946, after months and months of searching, of trying to figure out where the building had been located, because the destruction in the Warsaw in general and in the ghetto area in particular was so total, streets could not be easily identified. They had to guess at the locations, eventually finding where the school building had been. September the 18th, 1946, a group of 10 zinc and tin boxes that were tied with twine, covered with dirt, with clay. Those were brought out, and they found in those boxes paper documents that were wet, moldy, had suffered from being buried for several years, but they had been retrieved. The second group of documents retrieved in December of 1950 by construction workers in Warsaw were the ones found in the aluminum canisters. So we have Ringelblum 1, Ringelblum 2. The third cache of materials has never been found, even though efforts were made that went as far as getting the permission of the People's Republic of China to allow engineers to dig on the grounds of the Chinese embassy in Warsaw, which is now on the location where the third cache was thought to have been hidden. Was not recovered. We don't have it. It's probably lost forever. The records are incomplete, but it's what we have. I had the privilege to translate and edit for publication the English version of the latest catalog of the entire Oyneg Shabes archive, which is stored at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. The Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw is housed in the building where Ringelblum himself actually worked for a time in the Jewish self-help organization that was a cover in many ways for the operation of the archive. The Oyneg Shabes archive that's in Warsaw numbers approximately 35,000 pages of documentation in Yiddish, in Hebrew, in Polish, in German, and several other languages. The documentation is all kinds of things: diaries, interviews, questionnaires, fictional material, letters, postcards, transcriptions or copies of official documents that were borrowed from the Judenrat, from the Jewish Council, or were copied off of posters that the Germans put up. A vast array and variety of materials. Ringelblum employed Hersch Wasser, 27-year-old, 28-year-old young man with an MA in economics and business administration, who was also linkgestimmt, left-wing inclined, employed him as one of his secretaries in the Oyneg Shabes Secret Ghetto Archive project. It was Wasser's task to organize the work, to arrange for providing the pencil, the paper, the carbon paper, the typewriter ribbon for the few typewriters they had available, to make sure that the work was done. He was also the person who was in charge of organizing the material and then very delicately transferring it to the people involved with securing its survival, its concealment. The fact that he survived is nothing short of miraculous. And without his survival, we might not have the documents at all. After translating the large catalog for the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, I was contacted by Fruma Maurer and asked, would I be interested in helping to reorganize and produce a new finding aid for the Hersch Wasser collection that happens to include some material from Oyneg Shabes. I jumped at the opportunity because I would then actually be able to handle authentic material as opposed to working with catalog descriptions. So let's go back to 1946. After September 1946, after the documents have been retrieved, they are sopping wet, they are moldy, they are covered with fungus. They have to be dried out, and they have to be read and identified. Because of the need for security, they are not labeled, this is the name of the author, this is the name of the interviewer, this is the name of the typist. Rather, there are hints, there are abbreviations, there are nicknames that are used, which get in the way. So Hersch Wasser, in his new career working with the Central Jewish Historical Commission, the predecessor of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, he sat down and physically went through the entire first cache of documents and identified as best he could from the handwriting, from the symbols, from the little indications, who wrote it, when it was written, who was the copyist, what were the circumstances. And he pinned those notes as he went along. It's a very important service that he provided, although it's not entirely perfect, it's the best that we've got. Among the things we learn from Wasser's contribution is that the nickname that was used for Emanuel Ringelblum was Bliemel, which is an allusion to the last syllable of Ringelblum's name, flower, Bliemel, a little flower. For security reasons, the documents were generally not clearly labeled, as I said. They were kept carefully hidden away. They were copied. Ringelblum was very, very insistent on making multiple copies. Now, nowadays, we have scanners, we have printers, we have photocopying machines. No problem. How many hundreds do you want? There, in the Warsaw Ghetto, it was done laboriously by hand writing copies, transcriptions, by typing when possible. If possible, they made 3, 4, 5, even half a dozen copies of important documents. The idea being that they would be scattered around, not stored together. One of the signs of the panic that hit the entire Warsaw Jewish community in the summer of 1942 is that, in fact, all the copies or multiple copies of the same documents were found stored together in that first cache. They weren't able to do what they had planned to do. As they say, fog of war interferes with the best plans of the best generals. I use the military comparison advisedly. Ringelblum and Wasser and the others who worked in this considered this an act of cultural resistance. They were not fighting with bullets and bombs. They were fighting with paper and pencil and pen and carbon paper in order to provide the basis for telling the story of the crimes being committed by the Germans and their henchmen, and to try to describe what the Jews went through and what they were thinking day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, through the catastrophe that it's called nowadays the Holocaust. So why are we talking today about part of the Oyneg Shabes archive that's not in Warsaw but here at YIVO? I'm interested in it because I got to work on the catalog of the main collection, but why here? And for this I have to use the Yiddish expression, "Do liegt der Hund begraben." This is where the secret's here. The material arrived here at YIVO because Hersch Wasser decided he couldn't trust that the documents would remain accessible and that they would be published in an honorable fashion under the circumstances in the developing Soviet regime in Eastern Europe, in Poland in particular. Hersch Wasser survived the German occupation by several miracles. In April of 1943, he was captured by the Germans and put on a boxcar headed for Treblinka. He jumped off of a boxcar and escaped. In September of 1944, he and his wife and 3 other survivors of the uprising were in a hideout in the Żoliborz section of Warsaw. The Germans found them. There was a gun battle. All the people in the hideout were killed in the gun battle except for Hersch Wasser and his wife Bluma, who somehow survived. And because of their survival, they were able to continue the work of Oyneg Shabes. Like the last survivors of a military unit on an important mission, they're the only ones left, and they're still committed to achieving the goal, the delivery of what they've been entrusted with, the record of the materials of what happened. In the spring and summer of 1946, Wasser was in New York as part of a delegation from the Central Committee of Jews in Poland. While he was here in New York, He met with the administrator of YIVO, Mark Uwieler, and with Dr. Max Weinreich, and they talked about things, including a plan that the Central Jewish Historical Commission would photocopy all of the documents in the Ringelblum materials and the Oyneg Shabes materials and make them available to YIVO. Never happened, didn't happen, at least not yet, it hasn't happened. But secretly, a second negotiation occurred. Documents here in the YIVO archive, including within the Hersch collection, include a contract, a signed contract between the leadership of YIVO and Hersch, promising Hersch a job, a 2-year contract, to be a teacher and researcher here at YIVO, when it was on 123rd Street at that time. He'll be paid $60 a week, 2 weeks paid vacation. He would get free transatlantic round-trip ship ticket, although for his wife, he'd have to pay for it out of his salary. This was there. There was one condition. He had to arrive and be at work in New York on January the 1st, 1947. He never got here. Instead, he stayed for another 3 years in Poland conducting business of a certain kind. In the Oyneg Shabes collection materials that are here in the Hersch collection, there are approximately 50 envelopes. All of the envelopes have postmarks on them indicating they were sent registered mail, important documents. Each of them has a different return address, either in Poland or in Paris in France or in Stockholm in Sweden or in several other countries. And the addressee in each case is either Mr. Mark Uwieler or Dr. Max Weinreich, and gives the address 535 123rd Street, Manhattan, New York. This was being smuggled out. None of the return addresses are Hersch because what he was doing was out and out illegal. He was taking historical documentation and exporting it. He was not doing it for personal gain. He was doing it because he did not trust that the materials would remain accessible. Therefore, something had to be done. Now, he couldn't take everything with him. He could only arrange to send a few things. So there used to be a game that was played with children in schools. I don't know if they still do it. The child is told, well, you're going on a trip to the moon. We'll provide you with food and water and oxygen and everything, but you can only take a tiny little suitcase. What will you put into it? Remember, no food, no water, all that's taken care of. What's the really important stuff that you'll take along? What did Wasser decide was vitally important to send? So I'm going to show you some images of some of these materials as we go along. This is Emanuel Ringelblum. He was born in 1900, so he's a relatively young man at the beginning of the Second World War, 39 years old. History is not an old guy's profession, perhaps. Hersch Wasser, born in 1912, 27 years old. When he undertakes the mission, starts smuggling materials out to New York, he's in his middle 30s. His wife, Bluma. Israel Lichtenstein, who was administrator of the Borochov School of the Left Poale Zion, Left Labor Zionists, Yiddish Hebrew school in day school in Warsaw. Lichtenstein was the man in charge of securing the survival of the documents. He was the one who literally had control of the materials. He was the one, together with two teenagers, David Grabar and Nochem Givach. They were the last three people to pack the documents and then bury them carefully so that they would possibly survive. Their last documents that were placed on top of the papers in several of the containers are quite moving and amazing materials to read. When the materials were uncovered, you see on the right Hersch Wasser paging through some of the materials, Rochel Auerbach, the third survivor of the Oyneg Shabes team, looking through as well. The task of finding the material was quite daunting. These are photographs that are, for several of them are from the Jürgen Stroop commemorative album about the destruction of the Warsaw Jewish community. The damage was horrific, wiping out the organized street grid. Those of you who were here earlier and saw the film, you saw some of the footage that is motion picture materials. Among the materials that were sent over were reports that were prepared by Ringelblum, by Wasser, and by the second secretary of the group, Eliyahu Gutkovsky. Gehenna Żydów pod okupacją hitlerowską, the hell of the Jews under Nazi or Hitlerite occupation. An overview of what's going on, talking about conditions in Warsaw itself and in many communities, the ghettoization, confiscation of Jewish properties, mass killings in many localities, beginning especially from June 1941 with the invasion of Soviet territory. And there are express descriptions of the operations of the extermination centers at Chełmno, which begins operation on December 7, 8, 1941, and Treblinka, which begins operation in spring 42. These materials were prepared in Polish. We were talking beforehand about what languages Polish Jews were multilingual people. They spoke Yiddish, some got Yiddish, mówili po polsku, other languages, Hebrew, and so on. What language do you use? It depends on the circumstance. It depends on what materials. Simon Pisar used to say that if he wanted to tell jokes, Yiddish was the best language. If he wanted to discuss philosophy, French was the best language. If you wanted to discuss military things, German was the best language. Diplomacy, English the best language. For cursing, he preferred Russian. These materials were prepared and smuggled out to the Polish underground with the idea that they would use their contacts through couriers like Jan Karski, who would bring them at risk of their own lives to bring them out of Europe, bring it to Britain or to the United States so that the word would get out. The Megillah von Pein und Ausrottung, a Yiddish text about the roundups of Jews in many communities in central Poland in spring 1942, towns like Otwock, Tłuszcz, Włodawa, Dęblin, Ryki, Konskowola, Chelm, the town of all the wise men of Chelm, all those stories, a town in the center of the region where Yitzhak Bashevis Singer based many of his stories, where Gore is located, Bilgore, where Zamość is located, and so on. These were the sites of atrocities of horrendous nature, and they were documented. And there were some of the documentation was distorted. For example, hearing that at Treblinka people were being killed using something called a death stick. It's not accurate, but there's something about technology being used. The testimony of Jakub Granovsky, his real name was Schlamek, either Wiener or Beiler, we don't know for sure. He was given a code name, Jakub Granovsky. Schlamek Wiener was quite a remarkable person. I'm going to direct you to do some reading. I can do that as a professor. Martin Gilbert's 1985 book called The Holocaust, a one-volume history of the Holocaust based largely on primary sources and interviews with survivors in a chronological fashion. Chapter 16 is a complete translation of Schlamek's testimony, 40 pages typed that were taken down by Hersch Wasser interviewing Schlamek and Hersch Wasser's wife Bluma taking shorthand and then typing it up carefully, multiple copies. Schlamek was from the town of Izbica in western Poland. On January the 6th of 1942, the Jews of Izbica were sent to Chełmno. Most of them were killed immediately in the gas vans that were used there, but some of the men were chosen to be members of the Sonderkommando, the unit to handle the bodies. Schlamek was in such a group, and he describes how this worked. He describes what people talked about. He describes the practice in his group every morning of reciting the vidui, the confession. Yashamnu, Bagadnu, and so on, every morning, and then in the evening, recitation of Shema, the Hero Israel, and the evening prayers and Kaddish for those that they had worked with. Very strange reality. Shlamik escaped and managed to make his way to Warsaw and managed to make his way to Hersch Wasser. One of the ways Hersch Wasser was positioned to be in contact with people who could tell him important information, who should be interviewed, Wasser was in charge of the Landsmannschaft division of the Jewish self-help organization. Landsmannschaften are hometown societies. Many of you may be members of them. People give help to the people they're close to, they talk to. And this was a basis for getting information from all over Poland and adjacent countries. Shlamik was interviewed, but he was hot stuff. Shlamik had relatives in Zamość, the town that Yud Lamed Peretz was born and raised in. Shlamik was given money and help to leave Warsaw to go to his relatives in Zamość. Before he left, Shlamik went to a photographer in the Warsaw Ghetto, had a photo made of himself, and gave it as a souvenir to his good friends, Hersch and Blume Wasser. It remained in the archive. There's a little more, though. I'm focusing on him a little more, but he deserves it. Shlamik is in Zamość, and in Cholomoid Pesach, beginning of April of 1942, he sends a coded postcard written in Roman characters, but partly German, partly Yiddish, partly Polish, and incorrect spelling, all kinds, revealing Belzec is in operation. Belzec, where 600,000 plus people were murdered. And Shlamik is terrified that all the Jews in the area, including himself, are going to be sent there. But you need to know, he sent this to Hersch Wasser so to become part of the database. The liquidation of the ghetto of Gorlice, a detailed description of what happened in one particular town and the process of this. This is in the area of southwestern Poland near a place called Bobov. The Bobover Hasidim and so on, who were virtually wiped out, they've reestablished themselves in Borough Park and in Flatbush. Huge community. If you go to 14th Avenue near 53rd Street in Borough Park, you can see the 7-story Beis Ruchel day school that they have for girls there, several thousand students. In the hometown itself, nothing, because of these acts of brutality. Emanuel Ringelblum himself kept a diary. Wasser writes in his own diary that Ringelblum was always writing on something, always had something, scribbling. And some of the scribbling is harder to read, easier to read. It was typed up. And here in one small document, references to executions in the Pawiak main prison in Warsaw, that 20 Jews were killed in the town of Molava, that the 2 trolley workers, trolley operating within the ghetto, were shot dead. Mortality in the month of April in 1942 is horrendous. Details about the expulsion of Jews from Krubishuv, Jews being tortured in Pawiak, and more and more and more. Another diarist in the Warsaw Ghetto was Abram Levin, who before the war was a history teacher together with Emanuel Ringelblum at the same high school, the Yehudit High School in Warsaw. He wrote in Yiddish, and he mentions in passing in the diary meetings of the Oyneg Shabes, but he doesn't say what is discussed. He says there was a Shabbos, Oyneg Shabes, very important. We know that he attended a meeting in July of 1942 when it was discussed who should get the documents if nobody survives. And it was expressly decided that Raphael Mahler, the Polish Jewish historian who was in New York at that point, who was a schoolmate of Ringelblum's, should either get the documents, or Tante YIVO, is what it says in the Aunt YIVO, should have the documents, and it specifies, including the stuff that's at under 68, the allusion to the address of that building. Postcards. Now, these are strange things. How did they get into the collection? These are postcards that show evidence of having been examined by the official German postal censors. I'll show you the evidence in a moment. There are postmarks on here, but look at this. What are the addresses? New York, Paris, Newton, Massachusetts, outside Boston. These were postcards that Jews had written to appeal for food parcels. This is the content. They had to be written in Roman characters. And you'll see the censor has blacked out certain lines and so on. Somehow these got to the censor, they were blacked out, they went back to the post office, and they ended up with the Oyneg Shabes. Official documents of Jews who were workers in the Warsaw Ghetto. German and Polish language, name, address, background information, photographs, such as Stella Feierstein, born in 1922, so this ID card was made when she was approximately 20 years old. An announcement of a concert in the Warsaw Ghetto, February 9th, 1941. This is part of the programming of the YIKOR, Jiddische Kulturorganisatie. Hersch Wasser was very much involved in this, believed in Yiddish culture with heart and soul. They continued to work for about 2.5 years until April of 1942, when in one night the Germans made a point of arresting and shooting 53 cultural activists, including Menachem Linder, who was an attorney and young economic historian that Ringelblum remarks would have become an important figure in YIVO in future years. There were all kinds of cultural events in the Warsaw Ghetto. If you've seen the movie or read the memoir Pianist by Władysław Szpilman, you get an idea of nightclub cabaret life that people might be interested in, even with all the horrible things going on, or maybe more so for that. Collections of folklore from the Warsaw Ghetto in the Wasser collection, lists of things like curses, blessings, ghetto advertisements, jokes, new expressions, old expressions with new meanings, a whole bunch of sayings called Rubenstein Zucht. They're not the most funny things of all, but they show that people had humor and tried to deal with things through that humor. Food, im ein kemach ein Torah. If there's no flour, there's no Torah, there's no existence, this comes first. Rationing. Was there enough food in the Warsaw Ghetto to feed everybody? The short answer is not enough. Not everybody enough. Ringelblum writes in his diary in one place, should we give everyone an equal spoonful and everyone starves, or do we decide who should get more? Smuggling supplemented the rationing significantly. And this is a very highly developed system of ration cards. In the spring of 1942, they added an overprint. Dziecko to największa nasza świętość. The child is our most sacred thing. Nasze dzieci muszą żyć. Our children must live. The Judenrat, the Jewish Council, charged money to people to buy the ration coupons. Some people said that's not fair, people are poor. They needed the revenue to provide food for the neediest, the weakest, the children. Bekanntmachungen, posters put up trilingually in German, Polish, Yiddish, announcing new rations, announcing different conditions going on within the ghetto. There are many such posters around. This is an original. In many cases, they couldn't get the original, so somebody went out with a notebook and hand copied the text, making a transcription. Reports from social welfare organizations, so-called non-governmental bodies in the Warsaw Ghetto. Centos was a pre-war Jewish organization which cared for orphans and children in general, Jewish children in general. This is a document including notations about the importance of holiday observances for children in the Centos institutions, February 1942. One of those observances was Dzień Dziecka, the day of the Child's Day, Day of the Child, which was set for Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, the season between Passover and Shavuot, in the spring in 1942. Adam Chernyakov, The chairman of the Jewish Council, the Judenrat of Warsaw, wrote in his diary that he knew that people were criticizing him for wasting time on this children's programming, Children's Day business. And he writes in passing, he feels like the captain of a great ship which is sinking, and he has nothing that he can do to save anyone except to tell the band, play some music. Transcripts from underground press, from the Polish underground press. There's a huge library of Polish underground newspapers that were published throughout the occupation. This is from Bulletin Informacyjny, one of the major ones, from the 13th of May, 1943. The story is, the resistance of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto has not ended already. In the current week that's being reported, the Germans burned the northern side of Leshno Street, where there was significant damage to its church. Every night, rifle fire can be heard. According to reliable sources, there are fortified underground shelters in tenements where the Germans are using poison gas. Members of the Presidium of the Jewish Council, who had been imprisoned since the beginning of the liquidation, and held in a jail at Żelazna 103, have been shot. Until the moment that we are writing this article, the author of the article says, the ghetto's resistance has been continuing for 24 days. That compares to the resistance of the city of Warsaw against the German siege in September of '39. On April 23, 1923, the leadership of the Jewish Fighting Organization, the JOB, issued a proclamation to Poles, citizens, soldiers of freedom, calling for the continuance of the fight for your freedom and ours, for your dignity and ours, and for resistance against the German criminals. Copy of one of the sets of information that was transmitted by courier to London regarding what was going on in the Lodz Ghetto. Gazeta Żydowska. Although the Germans banned most Jewish publication, they did allow, for certain reasons, they allowed a Polish language weekly to come out in Warsaw and Krakow with news. It was only 4 pages. Ringelblum writes in his diary that no respectable person would read it and no respectable person would write for it. And yet, somebody was buying it and somebody was looking at it, and it had some information. Now, what's the most important? In a dictatorial regime's censored publications, the front page may not be the most interesting. I like the back page with the advertisements. Take a look at the advertisements. You start at the fold. Just below the fold, there's an ad for one theater with Verkaufte Neshumas, a play, Sold Souls. Then there's another play called Od Gemina do Femina, which is probably a comedy review from the Jewish community to the Femina theater. The Idische Chasene, a musical play which is very possibly the one which was composed by and originally played by Pesach Geburstein, Mike Burstyn's late father. That was a hit throughout Poland and Lithuania and elsewhere. Still a hit in the Warsaw Ghetto. Above this, Das Große Gewinns, the play based on a story by Sholem Aleichem. It's also been produced under the title 200,000, 200,000, the size of the lottery win. And then, if you're still not tired of theater, there's one more. On the upper left corner, Mirle Ephros, Der Jiddische Königin Lear, the Jewish Queen Lear story. 5 Jewish theater productions going on simultaneously in 1941, September 41, when the death toll is horrendous. The librarian of the Vilna ghetto, who was from Warsaw, Kruk, Hermann Kruk, remarked in his diary, in a Beis Oilem spielt man nicht kein Theater. You don't put on plays in a theater, and then he took it back because he saw that even in Vilna, where people knew what was happening, The night before they were to be deported, people went to the theater. The theater was packed. It was a comfort. It was something. It's quite remarkable, strange. Another underground publication, Barakada Volnoshchi. The Jews also had their underground publications. The Oyneg Shabes published Mitteilungen, news reports, bulletins in Polish and in Yiddish that were to provide information to Jews as well as to the Polish underground to spread elsewhere. In this case, Naród is a Polish newspaper, and it's got a story. Likwidacja warszawskiego getta z dniem, the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto from the 22nd of July has started. And it gives a detailed story of this. The Bulletin in Yiddish. This is a 165-page newspaper. It's a book published by the Hashomer HaTzair, Marxist Zionist political youth movement. Hashomer HaTzair, Iton HaTnua, the newspaper of the movement. The picture on the front is a dedication, La Kibbutz HaArtzi, in honor of the Kibbutz HaArtzi Federation of Kibbutzim, of collective settlements in Israel, on their XV 15th anniversary, from Hatnua Bagitaot, from the movement in the ghettos, looking from behind the ghetto walls through a breach in the walls at the tower, representing the image of the Choma Migdal, the tower and stockade of the kibbutzim as various fortifications that would establish a new land, a new country. 165 pages. A couple of the pages, Wierzymy w człowieka I w ziemię. We believe in the human being and in the soil. Socialist farmers. Here's soil. Tief tire in Drerd. Deep in the ground. Look at this. Look at the image. Look at the boards that have to be placed in there to keep this from cracking down. Notice the man who's standing in the hole wearing a suit and tie jacket, special occasion. They're pulling out tin boxes. Rochel Auerbach, as I mentioned, the third person who survived. A couple more slides and then I will finish this rather overlong presentation. This is a summary of a statement by General Sikorski, the head of the Polish government in exile. It is 50 lines of detailed material that was broadcast over the BBC. 3/4 of the way down, you can sort of see a reddish area. If you looked at it very carefully, it would say that the the Jewish people has been condemned to destruction. The slogan of the Germans is to uproot and annihilate the Jews without regard to whether or not they will win the war. The late Lucy Davidovich, in her history of the Holocaust, she used the title, The War Against the Jews. She argued, in fact, there were two different wars going on. The war the Allies were fighting against the Germans, and then there was the war the Germans were fighting against the Jews. And the Allies were busy with their own war for the most part, she would imply. A page from Ringelblum's diary, many, many pages. His diary was published, if you want to read it in the original Yiddish. It's available in a 3-volume edition. Portions have been published in English. As I mentioned at the beginning, the catalog of the diary, I want to show you something from the cover. Cover art is interesting. In this case, they were able to include the corroded metal canisters, the milk canisters, the tin boxes, but also something here. Look at it carefully. It's got color. It's a candy wrapper. There were candies that were sold in the Warsaw Ghetto, made in the ghetto, by the Victoria Candy Company. It's a good name, Victoria. Victoria in Polish means victory. It's the word that was used by the Athenian warrior who ran 26 miles from the battle with the Persian army to tell the Greeks that they had won. And he cries out with his last breath, Nike, victory, Victoria. In Polish, it says, the slogan is dla wszystkich, for everyone. In Yiddish, it's interesting. It's the same but different. For alle gleich. Not just for everybody, but for everyone equally. There's politics in candy. All right. So, I appreciate your patience with this. I apologize to you for going a little longer than I was supposed to, but I wanted to.
Thanks to everyone. I have to say, I am now 34 years in the Academy. I have participated in many events labeled as roundtables. This is the first time I've seen a round table, actually, at one of these events, and yet I'm going to deliver some remarks standing. I want simply to make some more general observations about the work of Hersch and of Emanuel Ringelblum in assembling the materials that are located in the Hersch collection here at YIVO. Professor Shapiro noted that there's strong evidence that Ringelblum, who had been closely associated with YIVO before the war, hoped that the entire Oyneg Shabes archive would eventually be housed in YIVO's New York headquarters. There's another piece of evidence beside the one that he mentioned, and that is a letter that Ringelblum wrote on the 1st of March 1944 to a man named Adolf Berman. And in this letter, Ringelblum designated YIVO and Ringelblum's colleague, Raphael Mahler, whom Professor Shapiro mentioned, as his heirs. Now, on the same day, 1st of March 1944, this is a couple of weeks before Ringelblum's own hiding place was discovered and he himself met his death, Ringelblum and Berman together wrote a letter directly to YIVO's headquarters in New York, in which they described the contents of the archive. This is the first description that we have of what exactly was collected over the years in the ghetto. Now, to me, one of the most striking aspects of both of these documents, neither of which, for better or worse, is part of the Wasser collection here at YIVO, is the role that this man, Adolf Berman, played in them. Because from that role, we can learn something about the Oyneg Shabes archive that I don't think is very well understood. See, Adolf, or Avrom Berman, was the head of the underground Jewish National Committee in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Jewish National Committee was made up of representatives of half a dozen or so Zionist political parties. Its purpose was to supervise the activities of the Zionist groups that were involved in the Jewish Fighting Organization in the ghetto, as well as to coordinate with other underground Jewish political parties about ways to support the remaining Jewish population throughout Nazi-occupied Poland. Berman's close relationship with Ringelblum, which is testified to by those letters, indicate something that Professor Shapiro mentioned in passing, but that I would like to dwell on with a bit more emphasis. And that is that the underground archive that Ringelblum managed and for which Hersch worked was regarded in its day as an integral part of a much broader Jewish self-help and resistance movement. In fact, the letter that Ringelblum and Berman wrote together on the 1st of March 1944 described the archive in precisely that context. The letter was concerned in the first instance with describing the full range of social and cultural and military activities that the ghetto Jews had undertaken so that they could both, in the words of this document, live with honor and die with honor. The archive was presented as one of those activities. Now, think about this for a second, because this seems to me like really a remarkable statement. In essence, it means that the public body that assumed responsibility for all organized efforts by Jews to remain on their feet in the face of the Nazi onslaught against them decided that collecting documents that would inform future generations about what Ringelblum called the greatest crime in history was a worthy activity on which to spend precious and ever dwindling public resources, even at a time when those resources were desperately needed to obtain food and clothing for ghetto residents, and eventually arms for the ghetto fighters. Ringelblum himself made an even bolder claim in his own history of the Oyneg Shabes project, which he wrote in January 1943 after the first cache had been buried. In that essay, he asserted that, and I quote his words, "When liberation arrives, society will bestow upon the workers of the underground archive the highest honor in all of free Europe." End quote. Now think about this again. This is a claim that effectively posits at least a moral equivalence between collecting documents and armed resistance. Because if document workers deserved the highest honor, then nothing could be more important than what they had done. Now, if so, and if that claim was accepted by the leadership of the Jewish underground in Warsaw, which it appears to have been, witness Berman's endorsement, then the Jewish underground was unique among all European resistance movements. No other underground anywhere in Europe devoted any notable resources to compiling a historical record for future generations. So the Hersch Wasser collection at YIVO, together with a much larger piece of the Oyneg Shabes archive that's housed at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, is in and of itself testimony to a very unusual scale of values that prevailed among East European Jews under Nazi occupation. Now, keep in mind, operating this archive was not an inexpensive undertaking. The workers who collected the material, who transcribed and who typed the copies, who maintained the records of the operation, needed to be fed. They needed to be housed. The same was true for the people who produced the studies of Jewish life under Nazi occupation that you saw projected on the screen here. Basic equipment like typewriters and typewriter ribbons and paper needed to be purchased. In August 1941, the archive spent 390 zlotych. That was the price of nearly 100 kilograms of bread on those tin boxes in which the collections were eventually stored. From the archive's own account books, which we have among the many documents that were collected, and from the studies that the archive made about economic life in the ghetto, we're able to determine that at a minimum the archive spent an amount equal to the cost of daily sustenance for 30 families. Or later, the cost of about 30 rounds of ammunition. In most months of its operation, the expenditures were considerably greater. Now, this operation was financed largely by contributions from a handful of prominent figures in the Warsaw Jewish community whose personal resources were also naturally dwindling as the occupation wore on, and who were called upon to provide a much greater range of support for people who needed food to stay alive. So these kind of trade-offs became that much more fateful as time passed. And yet, to the end, financial support for the archive doesn't appear to have decreased. The community, the Jewish community in Warsaw, under siege, living under conditions of progressive starvation, evidently believed throughout that the Ringelblum's historical documentation project was worth its price in food and weapons. Now, that choice, ladies and gentlemen, isn't at all self-evident. So I'd like to take a couple of minutes to think about what lay behind it. It seems to me that what lay behind it was largely the same impulse that made Ringelblum and Berman regard YIVO as the archive's proper heir. You see, Ringelblum himself was heir to much the same attitude toward historical research and documentation that had animated many of YIVO's own founders, particularly its historical section. Those founders traced their intellectual lineage largely to the great Russian Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov, who, following the famous pogrom in Kishinev in 1903, had spearheaded the establishment of what he called, quote, a secret bureau for gathering every piece of information from the city of slaughter and making the information available to our associates abroad for publication in the press as a means of arousing public protests in Europe and America against the evil regime in Russia. Dubnov, in his day, had conceived of this activity as an integral part of a four-pronged strategy of Jewish self-help and, if you will, resistance. The other three were political activism, physical self-defense, and migration. For Dubnov, documentation of the oppressor's crimes was no less vital a component of this strategy than was taking up arms against pogromists. Not only because, like armed self-defense, it stood to check the ability of the Jews' enemies, in this case the Russian imperial government, to do them immediate harm, but also because it could help to create a favorable climate of opinion toward Jews in the countries where they hope to find refuge, and the governments whom they hoped would intervene on their behalf. Now, 15 years later, this same thinking was manifested once again in the face of the bloody anti-Jewish riots that followed the end of the First World War in Ukraine. At that time, when 60,000 Jews had met their deaths in the single most catastrophic effort of collective violence directed against Jews until the Holocaust, one of Dubnov's disciples, a man by the name of Elio Cherikover, founded what he called the East European Jewish Historical Archive as a base from which to launch projects that were aimed at arousing world opinion about the physical precariousness of the Jews' existence all through that great East European Jewish heartland. Cherikover's efforts actually appeared to reap tangible dividends in the year 1927, when documents from his archive contributed significantly to the acquittal of Sholem Schwarzbart, who had assassinated the Ukrainian leader Simon Petlura in revenge for the death of those 60,000 Ukrainian Jews in 1918 and 1919. A prominent Yiddish language journalist located here in New York at that time, a man by the name of Avram Lessing, explained after Schwarzbart had committed his deed that a conspiracy of silence was necessary for Israel's enemies to commit these kind of outrages. So anyone who broke the conspiracy of silence by documenting and publicizing anti-Jewish atrocities helped to avenge the Jewish people no less than those who fought the enemy face to face. And I should point out parenthetically that Cherikover was the first director of YIVO's historical section, and the bulk of his vast archive eventually made it to New York, where it is available to scholars here in this building and has informed considerable work about the history of East European Jews in the 19th and the early 20th century. Now, there was also another dimension to the documentary impulse that was not only Ringelblum's, but that was, as I'm suggesting, part and parcel of the culture of East European Jews. You see, Dubnov and Cherikover and Ringelblum and Wasser, all of these people came of age and pursued their professional careers at a time when the history of a group was taken to be a measure of its human value. Groups that could present to the world an illustrious past felt that they had a strong political claim to recognition and to prestige. Whereas groups whose past was obscure or unremarkable were routinely relegated to the lower ranks of the international community. This was an attitude that found expression, among other places, in an ongoing public debate in interwar Poland, in which Ringelblum himself was a participant. A debate concerning the relative degree to which the country's various ethnic groups had contributed to Poland's historical well-being. Much of Ringelblum's own writing in the 1920s and in the 1930s was dedicated to demonstrating that Jews had been an integral part of Polish society as it had crystallized over the centuries, and that Jews were firmly rooted in the historical experience of all of the inhabitants of the Polish lands. And so as early as 1926, Ringelblum declared that one of the purposes of YIVO's historical section, which had been founded just the year before, must be, and these are his words, not only to become familiar with the Jewish past, but to lay the groundwork for the struggle of Polish Jewry for national and social liberation by highlighting the positive qualities that Jews displayed in their social life over the centuries. Now, in 1940, with the Nazi occupiers threatening to obliterate all evidence of such positive qualities, that mission, not only for Ringelblum, but for the Jews of Warsaw and the Jews of Nazi-occupied Poland as a whole, became more crucial than ever. So no wonder that when Ringelblum decided in May of 1940 that, again in his words, it would be useful to endow this important work of collecting documents with a public character, he was able to recruit both significant material support and a circle of volunteers who were prepared to risk their lives to pursue it. That support never dwindled throughout the archive's existence. And no wonder, too, that when time came to find the documents a safe and a permanent home, he named YIVO its proper location. And we are fortunate at least to have been able to have fulfilled a portion of that will through the housing of the Hersch Wasser collection here at YIVO, through the work of Professor Shapiro in cataloging it, through the work of the YIVO archives and staff, making it available to all of us. Thank you.
So we have time for a little bit of discussion, but I want very much to open things up to your questions as well. And
I agree with your analysis of this, that they decided that making an archive was worth taking bread from the mouths of the 30 families or 60 families or whatever, or the bullets. They made a decision. In Judah Magnus's archive in Jerusalem, Judah Magnus, who was rabbi at Temple Emanuel early in the 20th century and who was one of the founders of the Joint Distribution Committee, the main foreign aid organization of the United States Jewish community. In his archive, there's a letter from Boris Bogan, who was the European director of the Joint, and eventually the director of the Joint, complaining in 1919 about the Kehillah leadership, the Jewish community leadership in Bialystok, who were taking money that was designated specifically to feed hungry children, and they were diverting 5 or 10% of that money to feed hungry teachers to teach those hungry children. And he thought that was just outrageous, it was immoral, it was misuse, and it was something he kept running into in a lot of other communities where there was a decision, we don't live by bread alone. There are some things that are so important that even if it means a sacrifice, it is to be undertaken. So it's consistent with the value structure in that society.
Very much so, and I think that one of the striking things about the totality of the picture that emerges from the Ringelblum material is that Jewish society under Nazi occupation in Poland, like East European Jewish society generally, was a highly contentious society. They argued about everything. They debated about everything. They called each other the most horrible names. The Ringelblum Archive project was not controversial. It may have been one of the only operations undertaken socially by Jews in underground that was not a subject of controversy. The Ringelblum Archive managed to unite people from all different political groups, really virtually alone among any of the operations that are associated with Jewish self-help. The leadership was closely associated with the left Poale Zion party, but Ringelblum himself and his closest associates were extremely concerned with establishing the archive on a broad basis of popular support, and they were successful. One really can learn an enormous amount about the fundamentals of the culture of East European Jewry from looking at the kind of public support that this project garnered. And I think that's really quite remarkable.
I'd like to just add one thing to this, which is that what you're describing in the Warsaw Ghetto it mirrored what happened in the Vilna Ghetto with the paper brigade and the saving of the YIVO archives by YIVO workers, burying the material, getting it out of the ghetto to Christian friends. They truly understood this. This was in their bones. It was in the bones of the society. And wherever YIVO workers were, this is where this happened. And we have that spirit to thank not just for the Hersch collection, but for the entire Vilna collection that we have here at the YIVO Institute.
One of the places that the Ghetto Archive was controversial is Lodz. In Lodz, where it was sponsored through the Rumkovsky administration, which is hyper-ramified bureaucracy, there were 16 people involved working in it on producing what would eventually become the Chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto that was researched and published by my late teacher, Lucien Dobroszycki. We know from Jakub Poznański's diary. Jakub Poznański was a trained agronomist, around 50 years old, with his wife and daughter, who made an amazing achievement. He had a diary that covered virtually the entire wartime in Lodz. He and his family stayed in Lodz, in the ghetto, for the entire time that the Germans were in Lodz, and they survived. That's an achievement. Poznański also had access on a almost daily basis to a daily newspaper in this isolated ghetto. There was an arrangement with a certain German worker who would forget to leave the paper he used to wrap his lunch in every day, and Poznański got to read it every day, and he had to analyze it. He also was one of the radio monitors in the ghetto. In the Oyneg Shabes archive, there is an interview with Bernard Ostrovsky, who was the only survivor of the 16 men and women who made the Chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto. In Poznański's diary, he mentions that his wife is a typist. Poznański's wife is a typist at the statistical department, where in one corner, one room, is this so-called archive, and he says they don't let people in there. But occasionally I get to read what they produce, and it's nothing much. It's just, it implies it's a sham, just a way to get some money and get some bread to live. So somebody quite intelligent, quite informed, totally not aware of what is going on with the material.
First of all, there were precisely 877 people who survived in the Łódź ghetto until the very end. So this is a ghetto of about 250,000 people when it was established in early 1940. Łódź is, in every sense, an unusual story. It's very different than Warsaw, because in Warsaw, you had a Judenrat that, for various reasons that will take us far too long into the afternoon and the evening to examine, allowed significant space for a parallel semi-legal and illegal community to operate alongside of it. In Łódź, the Judenrat, again, for a whole host of reasons that do not exhaust themselves with the personality of Mordechai Chaim Rumkovsky, didn't allow such a space. There was a much less ramified parallel community in Łódź. The Judenrat basically did everything. But even within the framework of the official community, certain activities like documentation could play a subversive function. And that function was not usually identifiable at the time, because as an open public undertaking, it was subject to scrutiny by the supervisors of the Judenrat. So the anecdote that you relate really testifies to the success of the people who were running that daily chronicle project in camouflaging its importance, even the people who might have seen it.
I think it's 4:30. We could continue this conversation well into the evening. I am certain of that. But I do want to let the audience to have a chance to ask questions. So, yes.
Various communist regimes following immediately the World War II opposed the publicizing, letting the people of their own country to know about all these atrocities with various degrees. Jonathan, you started saying that in Vilnius, when you were there, there was nothing there, and probably they refused to document. In Romania, I could tell you the fascist regime of Ion Antonescu, all the semi-Holocaust, because half of the Jews of Romania survived, but they were not being known during the entire communist era until 23 years ago, until 1989, and so there were various. The Jews, the Romanian Jews in Israel, they knew about it long before they were revealed in 1889. The Yad Vashem had all the data. Now, my question regarding the Warsaw Ghetto, what was the degree of resistance from the communist regime of Poland to cooperate, to let people in the West know, and how long time took the so-called smuggling and all those until all the archive was out? And so approximately what's the time frame when this took place?
The picture in Poland between the years 1944, when the eastern half of the country was liberated by the Red Army, and 1950, when any sort of Jewish institutions that could be regarded as autonomous in any way were curtailed. It's a very, very complicated one and a very interesting one. One of the first things that the temporary committee of Jews that was set up in Lublin in August 1944, under the auspices of the Polish Committee of National Liberation, which became the nucleus of the communist government, was a Central Jewish Historical Commission. A prominent trained professional historian, a man by the name of Philip Friedman, who had survived the warriors in Lvov, was appointed to direct it. That commission, which after all of Poland had been liberated by February of 1945, it set up branches in Kraków, in Łódź, and in Warsaw as well, published in 44, 45, 46, a series of documents, of testimonies, a dictionary of Nazi euphemisms, right? Some of the most fundamental research material that's still of value to scholars today was produced at that time by a Jewish organization operating under government imprimatur. Poland, or in Poland, you have to understand that the process of communization proceeded gradually. It wasn't that the communists came in 1944 and 1945 and everything changed. The communist regime had to go through a process of acquiring power that really wasn't complete until the end of 1946 and the beginning of 1947. And so for a few years there was space to publish these kinds of materials. The discovery of the first cache of the Ringelblum archive in the second half of 1946 received wide public coverage in Poland. There's an article that just appeared in the last volume of the journal Gal-Ed that actually describes public reaction to some of the documents as they were initially printed in Poland, so that much information was available. As time went on, the communist regime tried not so much to suppress publication of information, but to spin it in a way that gave a pride of place to communist elements in the underground, and that sought to interpret the Hitler years within the framework of the dominant Soviet interpretation of how history worked at that time. But there is no evidence of systematic efforts at suppression of knowledge in the early years of post-war Poland.
Do we have any information as to why Wasser took the extraordinary risk of not sharing information about the location of the archive with at least one other person?
There were other people who may have known, but they died. They were killed. And if you want to keep a secret, you keep it for real. There's a Germanic expression, if you want to have a secret discussion, it's unter vier Augen, only 4 eyes present. In Poland, there was a joke about, there's secret, very secret, top secret, and the most secret of all is the one that's labeled burn before reading. Such things, the fact that we have no indication that the Germans were aware of the existence of the archive is interesting. Ringelblum remarks in one of his writings that possibly the Germans actually sort of allowed space for publication and writing because they didn't care about it. It was like, it didn't matter to them. And so in some ways, there was more freedom of press, quote unquote, underground press in the Warsaw Ghetto than outside the ghetto during the occupation. It's a small group of people. Only somebody knows. Telling many people is not something that you do if you want to maintain real security about the material. But there's another archive that I'll mention in passing just because I feel loyalty to another archival project. It's the one of the Sonderkommando workers at Birkenau. In the summer and fall of 1944, Zalman Granovsky, Zalman Leventhal, Harab Lev, Langfuss, and a few other people made a point of writing, mostly in Yiddish, accounts of what they had seen and experienced, and they buried them in the ash pits surrounding the crematoria. Granovsky, in one of his writings, mentions that they also made a point of scattering tens of thousands of teeth. Turns out when you burn a human body at a very high temperature, the flesh goes, the bones eventually can be broken up, but the teeth are very stubborn. And so they made a point of scattering large numbers of teeth there, he writes, because he hoped that sometime in the future, perhaps in another century, people will dig, notice the oddity of all the teeth, and wonder what was here, and possibly find the documents. Those documents have all been found essentially accidentally, half a dozen of them, but he mentions in passing that at least 30 parcels of documents were supposedly prepared for burial, and most of them have never turned up. So we are limited in what we have. a tiny, tiny portion of what might have been known, what might have been produced. Much of it didn't survive. Some of it is totally illegible. We're missing the beginning of a page, the end of a page. We're missing the beginning of an article, the end of an article, and it makes a problem about what we can derive from it. But as a certain government official said, you go with the army you got. You go with the documents that you have. You don't make them up, if you're an honest historian.
Yes.
Actually, Professor Shapiro, that's a perfect segue into the question that I had for Professor Engel, which is that all the reasons that you cited for this documentation and why it was so important and people were willing to do without bread, et cetera, and how they'd be seen by people who might save them, et cetera. I was wondering how much inkling, if any, appears in the documentation, particularly the ones that were buried, the archives that were buried, where there's any implication that they thought it was necessary because maybe none of them would survive.
Oh, definitely. We see this in Ringelblum's own diaries. From late 1942, after the Great Deportation had been carried out, was living in constant expectation of his own mortality. There are explicit statements in some of the letters that Ringelblum wrote toward the end in his correspondence with Adolf Berman, for example, in which he says, all of us are convinced that we shall perish, and therefore it is vital to get the word out about the existence of our project, particularly to our friend Raphael Mahler in New York. But reports were sent about the existence of the archive to the Jewish representatives on the Polish National Council in London, who were associated with the Polish government in exile. Efforts were made to publicize the fact that this archive existed precisely because they all knew that they were living on the precipice, and Hersch, for example, could have had no real expectation that he would have survived, and you heard the circumstances under which he did. They are highly improbable.
Hi, I want to go from the particulars into a general question at the end, so bear with me. When I saw your advertisement, your promotion of this symposium film, my eyes sort of lit out. And why? Because my father was in the ghetto at the time of the uprising. He was on one of the last transports to Treblinka, and just as you mentioned before, he jumped off the train, and that's how he survived. The rest of his family had died, either in Treblinka or in the ghetto, starvation, disease. But anyway, I connected the two, and I thought, well, okay, I want to show films about resistance at my synagogue, a series of films. Because like you said, the views a lot has been, okay, we were passive and we didn't do anything about it, but there were courageous people, heroes out there. So I had a mini festival of documentaries, not this one obviously, but a few other ones like Partisans of Vilna and a few others. So I thought, well, there are people out there who are interested. I go to an egalitarian synagogue, it's liberal, whatever. So what I thought was, a few years before, there'd been a festival of commercial films, Hollywood commercial films, that went over fine. There was a sizable crowd, 50 people, whatever. I show my films, Total Apathy, maximum 5, all right? So anyway, my question is, the way films have been portrayed about Jewish history or this particular type of history, what are your opinions of the honesty, the depth, or maybe the appeasement of Hollywood to portray Jewish history, not just to Americans themselves, but also to Jewish Americans? That's how they get their view. So anyway, I'm sorry I went on too much, but that's my question.
It's a great
I'm
question.
giving a course in the fall, if you're interested, in the Holocaust in the movies. It's called Indelible Shadows, taking the title from Annette Insdorf's book. I think that Hollywood, or whoever is, if it's Hollywood on the Vistula or Hollywood on the Seine, fiction has freedom to do a variety of things, and it may not be very faithful to the record because the record doesn't quite fit. The recent discussions about Tony Kushner's screenplay for Lincoln, and also the discussions about Argo, about the rescue of some Americans disguised as Canadians, screen people in Tehran 30 years ago. Kushner would argue that you do things for dramatic effect and you should have freedom to do that. And Ben Affleck would argue that if it's more exciting to end the film with a chase scene and so on, then it's true on a certain metaphysical level. Now, problem. Which will be remembered more effectively, which has more influence on the public memory, public history? Will it be the careful scholarship of the people slaving away over desks in the library here and in the archive here? Or is it going to be the fiction that's done in Technicolor? That goes for almost any topic whatsoever. Some things are more faithful, some others. One of the films that I do make a point of showing that I respect very highly, even though it has certain problems with it, is one called Ostatni Etap, The Last Stage, by Wanda Jakubowska, who died not long ago, a survivor of Auschwitz, who in 1947-48 shot on location about a film about the women's camp at Birkenau and about the role of women at the Union explosives factory to smuggle in grain by grain explosives that would be used for resistance and so on, and about Rosa Rabota, the Dolmetscher translator, and her romance and all this. It's very dramatic, it's very interesting, it's very powerful, and it's fictionalized. Filmed on location by a director and a screenwriter who was herself a survivor, with survivors in many of the leading roles in the film, shot at Auschwitz. It's what it is, and we have no control over these things. So there's a need to look at it and to study it, and I hope try to make people more analytic and suspicious about any art that purports to present reality. But then Shakespeare's version of Julius Caesar's life and about the history of England and so on, it's great art. It's not necessarily the best of history, but that's a plague that's in general in the world.
Could you explain the name Oyneg Shabbat? Because that's, I mean, I know what it means in Hebrew.
Oyneg Shabes literally is the enjoyment of the Sabbath, and there's it's understood the Sabbath is a special day, and you enjoy it. Now, there are different kinds of Oyneg Shabes. Okay. Oyneg Shabes may be the nap in the afternoon. Sheina b'Shabbat ta'anug. Sleep on the Sabbath is a pleasure. It may be getting together with friends on a Friday night over tea and cookies and talking and singing.
Yeah.
It may be a group of friends getting together, as one of the documents in the Oyneg Shabes describes, a group of authors of diaries and a journal. I haven't been able to identify who's the author of the piece that mentions it. It was probably The Cup of Tears.
Levin. Avram Levin.
Abram Levin's diary. He mentions getting together for an Oyneg Shabes with the people who are writing, and they talk about what's going on. He says every time he goes to this, he gets a terrible headache, an awful headache, because everyone talks about all the terrible things that everyone is talking about, but he goes anyway, he has to. Hersch Wasser, in one of the last entries in his own diary, which ends at the end of April of 1942, apologizes after a fashion for the fact that for several weeks he had written nothing, because he writes that he just couldn't pick up a pen. What am I going to write about? The starvation, the inflation, or how about Treblinka? He writes that expressly. That people would not be so depressed as to be unable to do anything is something. So Oyneg Shabes is a cover name. It means also that Rabbi Shimon Huberband could attend, and things are going on with people and different things. It's a cover for gathering together. In Hersch Wasser's diary, he mentions Oyneg Shabes several times, but only very laconically, just mentioning there was an Oyneg Shabes, very interesting. Another Oyneg Shabes, very interesting. Nothing of substance, because it wouldn't be secure. When Ringelblum writes in his diary, many of the entries are in the form of letters addressed to an uncle in another country as a way of covering what these things are. In some cases, the dates are changed to pre-war in order to, if the Germans ever look at it, to confuse them. Parenthetic note, Anna Frank, in her diary, also used the form of letters to her imaginary friend Kitty. Right. There are many of these things that are used as a way of focusing the attention of the writer, but also maybe disguising what's going on.
In case it falls into the wrong hands?
Yeah. Let me mention a Lodz Ghetto diary by an 18-year-old boy. He writes in English in the margins of a French novel called Les Vrais Riches by François Coppée. In that entry, he writes, I did something horrible. I have to tell someone. I'm paraphrasing. What was the horrible thing I did? I ate my entire ration for the week of bread, and I was hungry. And I was lying there hungry, and I looked up to the place where my little sister, 12 years old, in May 1944, in the Lodz Ghetto, where she had put her ration that was supposed to last another 4 days. And he just got up and figured he'd take a little bit, but one thing led to another. He ate the whole thing. And when his sister comes home and she can't find it, she's beside herself, and he has to go around, he writes in English, calling down the curses of heaven on whoever would be so terrible as to steal the bread of a child. And he's cursing himself. Why is he writing in English? He says because it's one language that he knows that his sister doesn't know. In another entry, he mentions that he read his sister's diary. She starts copying him. She knows he's writing a diary. She can't read it. And she starts writing things, and he reads her diary and is so entranced by it that he copies out, translated into English, a poem that she writes about nostalgia for childhood. A 12-year-old with nostalgia for a childhood. So the material is shocking and amazing. I don't know the name of the boy. I don't know the name of the girl. I can assume with 99.99% certainty that they did not survive the war. But the diary did by accident. It was sitting in the trash on the bottom, on the floor in an apartment house in Lodz when a man came back from Auschwitz, looked in the house next door where he had lived, found nothing, happened to look in the next house, saw a book on the floor. A Jew sees a book, he picks it up, looks at it, noticed the diary entries, some of which are in English, some are in Yiddish, some are in Polish, some are in Hebrew, took it with him to Israel, and in 1969...
There's one in Latin.
One in Latin. The educational system, he probably went to, this boy probably was a student of the Mordechai Marcus Braude multilingual school. Wonderful school, heavy emphasis on languages. Anyway, the diary was donated to Yad Vashem in 1969, and portions of it, bits and pieces, have been published in English translation. The whole thing was translated into German and published in facsimile. I tried to get a publisher here to go along with bring out one in English, and so far it hasn't been bought. So, but they're interesting stories.
One more question. No, you. Okay.
A quasi-political question. Roosevelt and Churchill allowed Stalin to give strict orders not to close the Vistula at the end of '44. We had at this time units. I was one of the army units from the Polish army, part of the Soviet army. And we were there, we had artillery, tank brigades, you name it, ready to go. And what we have seen in the movie, we saw it every day, every night. Warsaw burning in front of our eyes. So it's a political question. I read an article saying recently, giving us statistics that could have saved so many Jews in Warsaw. I don't know if you have an answer for it, but this is a fact of life.
So the question, excuse me, the question is, why did Stalin stop at the Vistula? Oh, well, okay.
As to Roosevelt, I will commend to you a recent book by my colleague Richard Brightman called Roosevelt and the Jews. There's a review of it in today's New York Times. The most detailed archival research that has been done to date about Roosevelt's actions that had implications for the Jews of Europe is contained in that book. I'm not going to try to summarize everything. I will make simply one comment. If you ask why the encounter between the Third Reich and the Jews of Eastern Europe produced precisely the results that it did, with the number of deaths and the number of survivors that there were in fact, much of the answer has to do with the time that was available to the Germans to complete their work. Had the Germans had unlimited time, I think there is no question that every Jew who was located in the areas under German control would have perished. So the question is, why did Germany have precisely the amount of time that it did? In August of 1944, the Red Army was indeed sitting on the east bank of the Vistula River, and for political reasons that have been documented and have been discussed over and over again in subsequent years, it decided to stop. At the time, in August of 1944, there were 70,000 Jews still living in the Łódź Ghetto. The distance between Warsaw and Łódź is about a day-and-a-half march for an army. That's how much time it took once the Red Army did cross the Vistula. It's really not a significantly long distance. It's the distance from here to Baltimore. Okay. If the Soviets had decided to continue their march, there was a possibility that 70,000 Jews from Łódź would have remained alive instead of the 877 that did. It was at the end of August that those 70,000 were taken and deported to Auschwitz. And our entire evaluation of what we have come to call the Holocaust and the role of Jewish leadership in the Holocaust and the role of the Western Allies and the Soviets would be completely different. Just food for thought.
I would like to add one detail, which is that Stalin was intent on destroying the Polish nation. And so he stopped at the Vistula to a great extent in order to allow that to happen. He would then march across, and the job was already done for him. He had already taken measures long before to destroy the Polish Communist Party and many other aspects of Polish society. And so I think that one has to look at that decision not just in terms of allied Jewish relations, but in another context as well, which is Stalin's ambitions for what he knew would be a post-war world.
It was a race for Berlin, and we paid the price.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. He said it was a race for Berlin, and we paid the price for it. The Jews paid the price for it, to some extent. I think that's true. Genug. Thank you.